Hey Dubbie crew, it's me John coming at you with another video here about advertisement and how it would work within the Wizards of the Coast, the tabletop RPG world, all of that kind of combined together now that we're sort of in a holding pattern with the OGL. For those who are new to my channel, welcome. Basically, in short, I'm a business analyst who is starting a gaming channel, started about 6 weeks ago here now, and most of our time today, because of what's happening in the gaming news, is talking about the OGL 1.0, 1.1, 1.2, over to Creative Commons, and all the changes happening within a TTRPG world, and what that might mean for Wizards of the Coast. As opposed to from the perspective of a player or from the perspective of a content creator, even though I'm a mini content creator now, I'm really approaching this from a business analyst and what it might mean for Wizards of the Coast, seeing as how A, many of us don't know a lot about companies and how they would operate, and B, Wizards of the Coast is a notoriously tight-lipped company on what's actually happening throughout their business world and through their business strategies. Understandable because of the type of business that they run, but what types of things might be coming down the pipeline for them, and why are they making the decisions that they're making? And are they mistakes? Are they things that are going to impact them in the future in different ways that they don't anticipate? Or are they playing us all for fools and have found another new way to be able to take money from us? All of those things and more is kind of what we explore on this channel throughout this series here, in particular, the business of gaming. If that's right up your alley, then you've come to the right place. I'd love it if you could throw me a subscription to the channel. I'd love it if you could leave comments on the video for ideas of what you would like to see covered. And if you could like the video, all of those help me know that I'm on the right track with the type of stuff that you guys would want to see covered. And my goal is to give you guys the types of content that you would want to see so that hopefully I can get the channel to be monetized. There's a benefit for me. And if I'm able to get that benefit, then you guys get the benefit of having the content that's relevant to you and hopefully in a bit of a different spin than what you're used to. If you're a returning viewer to the channel, welcome back. Let's dive right in. On the last video that we went over, we were discussing some of the supposed advertisement figures that we would be trying to come up with as a community for Wizards of the Coast, and seeing how far apart we might be from Wizards of the Coast's ideal advertising revenue and what the community is worth to them in generating the types of content that they're creating, and what we feel the community would be worth. Because my gut told me there'd be a very large gap between those two figures. My instinct tells me, and my data analysis tells me, that Wizards of the Coast would view the community as worth very little in terms of advertising. Maybe as little as $0, but very little all the same. And my understanding is that the community themselves, with the millions of players, and in particular the content creators, the DMs, the people who would be influential within the community for Dungeons and Dragons and for their competitors as well, for Pathfinder and for the other games that we play and love, that community would view their value as very high. That makes sense. Everyone views their value as higher than it actually is. And where things get interesting is if that gap is very large. At the moment, the best figures that we have from the community, from some of the vociferous comments that we've received, in particular from one user, but this seems to be the consensus of the community that I'm seeing on Reddit, on Twitter, on other places as well, is that the community is worth hundreds of millions of dollars in advertising, which, for the record, is more than Dungeons and Dragons' entire revenue annually. And the community is worth that because of all the free work that they're putting out, the art that they're putting out as fans, the games that they're creating just in the act of being a DM and running games for people that other people watch when they can't play themselves. All of that generates revenue to the Dungeons and Dragons brand and makes the brand what it is. So Wizards of the Coast owns the intellectual property, or at least most of it, less than they used to now that they've released a lot of it under Creative Commons, but they own the intellectual property. But the real value of Dungeons and Dragons is here in the community, and part of that value is the advertising they generate. I respectfully disagree, and the reason that I would disagree is because Wizards of the Coast has clearly signaled, as have their competitors, that this is not worth spending advertising money on. My video yesterday that we'd released is showing an explanation of how that money can't be worth what we're saying it's worth as the community, because no one would be willing to go and fund that business plan. You couldn't go to a bank and say, this number of content creators creating this number of hours of content and this amount of eyeballs seeing advertisements is worth this level of advertising revenue. So give us that money and we'll give you this content, and you'll see how that's actually giving you value in seeing that content. In short, no, it doesn't work that way. And I think I want to elaborate a little bit more on that, because really when it comes to YouTube and other channels as well, but other advertising channels, let's call them, but we'll stick with YouTube as an example here. There's two kinds of advertising. One of them, you guys would have some power over as a community. And the other one, where the bulk of these numbers come from, you don't. And so we'll start with that one to get it out of the way. Most of those figures are based on YouTube's advertising algorithm. In other words, you have a YouTube channel on, and assuming you're not a YouTube premium member or someone who isn't seeing advertisements because of a VPN or something like that, you're getting advertising shown to you. It's either going to be ads playing between videos, in the middle of a video. You might have those banner ads that pop up. All of those would constitute YouTube's advertising model. And Wizards of the Coast doesn't really have much to do with that model, and I'll explain why here in a moment. But in short, all of that advertising revenue, none of it really goes to Wizards of the Coast. And I say none of it, it's a small percentage that would, but most of the companies that are advertising on the YouTube channels that you're watching have nothing to do with Wizards of the Coast and nothing to do with D&D. The most common ad that I get when I'm watching Critical Role, assuming I don't have YouTube Premium on, is for Verbo. As far as I can see, it has absolutely nothing to do with that. YouTube's algorithm is very powerful in the sense that it can see not just the video that you're watching, but all the other bits of data that you've given Google over your lifetime, assuming you have an account that you've signed up with them. Under that model, they have the ability to advertise you things that are not even just related to the product that you're watching about. So you could be watching a video about D&D, and the ad that you're getting could be for McDonald's or Coca-Cola or Verbo or to buy a car or any other thing. That's not surprising for any of you. I'm positive that you guys have all seen that. You've probably been surprised at what the algorithm can figure out about you. You probably suspect that YouTube, for example, listens through your phone microphone or your computer's microphone to see you've been talking about needing a bigger car and suddenly it's advertising minivans to you. Or you've been talking about needing a vacation or needing time off from work and it's advertising vacation homes for you or travel packages for you. And you're saying, I'm pretty sure I didn't search for this online and it's just listening to me. The short answer is yes, it is. They absolutely do figure out that type of advertising that way. They can also figure out advertising by searching what your roommate is searching for, or if you have kids in your house and they have their own devices, but it's on the same IP network, they can actually determine based on those searches what things to advertise to the parents and vice versa. It's scary in its own way, but it's very accurate advertising. This isn't a new model, but YouTube has the depth of data to be able to masterfully use that. As an example, I'm sure if you're my age or older, if you're younger, you might not know what I'm talking about here, but we used to have a thing we watched called television. It used to just be a box like a computer, but it could do almost nothing from that, and it would just show pictures at certain times. So if you wanted to watch a certain show, you actually had to sit down at the time the show was on, and if you needed to use a bathroom break or something like that, you had to wait till a commercial or risk missing the show. If you're younger, that sounds horrifying, and I guess in comparison it is, but at least we didn't have the computers trying to take over the world all the time. So pros and cons, right? For those of you who are old farts like myself, then you probably remember a point in time where maybe when you were like 12 and you were able to stay home alone, you would have called in sick from school. Like you would have told your mom you're sick and you can't go in. Or you would have said you're sick because you didn't want to pass in your homework that you didn't do or something like that. So you'd take a sick day. And you'd stay home and you'd watch TV. We all did. What kind of shows did you watch? Be things like Judge Judy, Wheel of Fortune, whatever was on at 2 p.m. when you're a sick kid and you're actually home earlier than everyone else. What kind of commercials were on those shows? I always remember there were like 3 categories of commercials, and it was kind of clever thinking about it as a teenager because I was always impressed that they knew what to advertise. And the ones I remember were payday loans, because they always had those ones, advertisements from lawyers or big law firms stating that if you were injured at work, they have a case for you that they'll be able to do pro bono. and you had commercials to get your ass off the couch and go back to school. And all of those have the same theme. You're watching TV at 2 in the afternoon. You're probably some unemployed loser. You should stop being an unemployed loser and find one of those paths to get back to work. Either go back to school, or maybe you're off work because you're injured and you should get some free money from a lawsuit or something like that. Or alternatively, you need a payday loan because you're off of work and that's eventually going to add up and you're going to need to borrow some money. So that type of advertisement made sense. Advertisements for toys were certainly prevalent, but only on kids' networks, and only when kids would actually be watching them. Advertisements for cars were when working families were off to work. So this model of not just advertising for the content you're watching, but knowing that the types of people watching this particular show are going to be interested in these types of things, it's the same model that YouTube uses. The important part here is none of that has anything to do with Wizards of the Coast. And I think I'm a personal example that can kind of demonstrate this. I'm going to ask you guys to trust me a little bit here, but I am someone who would have spent years under my account searching exactly 0 things about Dungeons and Dragons. Even though I was always someone interested in Magic the Gathering, Dungeons and Dragons has not been something I've been interested in throughout most of my adult life, if not all of it. Until about 6 weeks ago, when it would have been interesting to suddenly start talk about that on my channel, and that seems to be what's resonating with people. So I've gone from not searching at all to searching specifically about D&D content and specifically about how to get started in Dungeons and Dragons. In other words, demographically and based on my searching, I would be the prime customer for someone like Wizards of the Coast to say, right there, there's someone who's suddenly searching this, show them ads for our stuff, because this is our likely people to buy our goods and buy our services. This is the type of person we're looking for, not someone who's already playing, because those people have already bought things. Someone who now has the money to be able to buy it and they're showing an interest in it. How many ads have I gotten for D&D things? In watching shows like Critical Role and Dungeon Dudes and those kinds of shows, I'm watching the content where that type of stuff would be advertised, and I have seen exactly one advertisement, which was for the D&D movie. And I saw it only when I'd searched for when the D&D movie was on for a video that I made a few weeks ago, when it was released. I saw that ad once based on my searching. Even though I have spent probably 40 hours over the last month searching different things related to Dungeons and Dragons and their competitors, no point in there has Wizards of the Coast or any of those competitors advertised to me in a way that I knew they were advertising to me. So if they did it, it was very sneaky and hasn't worked, as my purchasing so far has been 0. That will likely change, but I don't think it's because of advertising that I've received. Here's my point in saying that. If a prime new customer isn't getting those kinds of advertisements, I don't believe Wizards of the Coast is seeing value in that kind of advertising on other channels either. I could be wrong. And if someone out there can show me evidence of, hey, here's me watching a channel about, I don't know, maybe watch Top Gear or something about cars, and you're seeing advertisements for D&D, let me know. Because if that's the case, that changes that model. But based on the assumptions that I can make right now, the YouTube algorithm doesn't seem to be profitable for that kind of revenue through advertising for Wizards of the Coast. They don't deem it profitable because they don't seem to be paying for that kind of ad space. They could be wrong, but they don't seem to be taking advantage of it. So that's that whole section of YouTube advertising. But there's another section of advertising as well. And this would be the in-video ads that are actually done by the content creator. So Critical Role, assuming you're familiar with that, would be a good example of this. They have their own advertisers that are showing ads not from YouTube, not like a pause of the video content that then shows you an ad that YouTube has decided based on their algorithm, but something the content creators are talking about. And I do know Critical Role, to use their example, has had advertising from Wizards of the Coast. As an example, I'm going through their third campaign now, the Hell's Bells one. And when it would have been around the time that Wizards of the Coast would have actually completed their purchase with D&D Beyond, they definitely had advertising about D&D Beyond. Whether it was pro or just sort of ham-fisted in there, I think is kind of their appeal. So the important part here is Wizards of the Coast either approached Critical Role or Critical Role approached Wizards of the Coast, or most likely they've been in constant communication with each other. And Wizards of the Coast would have given Critical Role some amount of money to talk about that D&D Beyond purchase. I'm sure they have done, and I'm probably not as familiar with, many of the other advertisings that they've actually done on their show too. So that's a whole second category, and that category is really interesting from an advertising model. And here's why. On the one hand, we don't need to talk about thousands of creators, because we all know 99.9% of all of the content creators, and there are thousands of them for Dungeons and Dragons, the vast majority of those content creators don't have anything like an in-video sponsorship that you'd be familiar with through Critical Role or some of the larger channels. How many D&D content creators actually have that type of in-video advertisement where they have a sponsor? The actual content creator is saying, this video today is brought to you by NordVPN. And when is it not a NordVPN, but it's actually by something D&D related, where you can imagine Wizards of the Coast has said, here's a bag of money for you to say something about this product, and then we expect that we're getting our money back from the virtue of you talking about that. So it's literally, we believe your advertising is worth this amount of money. How many content creators do you imagine fall into that for D&D specifically? And then we could broaden it slightly to the entire tabletop RPG level. Do you think it's 20? Out of thousands, how much smaller would we need to make that number before we don't really have something of an affiliate link or higher level of in-video advertising where the value is the content creator talking about it, not the type of content they're producing, having an algorithm decide that this ad is worthwhile showing to the people? Because those are two very different things. One is the value of YouTube. We know YouTube has an amazing advertising model. We know they have an amazing advertising model because just about every company who is a company worth advertising with advertises with YouTube. If they see value in it, if a lot of companies see value in it, it's easy to measure that YouTube's value is clearly advertisement. It's pretty much just advertisement. That's how YouTube makes money, and they're a very, very profitable company. Within Google, I'm where they're a division of a company, but as their own standalone thing, they by themselves are extremely valuable because they can target advertisements to the audiences that would be most likely to buy. So the advertising dollar, in theory, goes further. Wizards of the Coast doesn't seem to do that kind of advertising, and it's probably because the products they're selling, they don't see a lot of benefit or increase in sales in advertising that way. I think D&D has different ways to make money by advertising to a different group of people, but it's not the players of the tabletop RPG game. The ones who are searching that don't seem to get that kind of advertisement because, well, they're already searching for it. It seems like Wizards of the Coast is under the assumption that money has already been made or wasn't possible to make in the first place. Again, they could be wrong, but that seems to be the decision they're making based on what I can see from that kind of advertising. But in content advertisement, in having a content creator use their reputation to say this product is good and you should buy from them, that has value, and that is something Wizards of the Coast has certainly used, and their competitors like Paizo have certainly used as well. That would be the size of the value of this marketing that content creators could influence. And here's how. Instead of thinking about thousands of content creators trying to coalesce together to shut Wizards of the Coast out or to shut D&D content out to show that D&D should have valued that content higher. Instead of trying to do that, you wouldn't have to influence that many people. If you had 2 or 3, maybe even just 1 in the case of Critical Role, because their channel is so much larger than the other channels, if you had some of the large content creators, particularly the ones that new D&D players tend to use, and I'll post a link as to where I'm getting this math here. We have the sort of top 10 channels. This, I believe, was from September of 2022, so it could be a little bit different by now. And this is assuming that this site, which does some sort of, we'll call it gaming journalism, but it's not exactly that type of stuff, Let's assume the information they've compiled here with the site that I'm going to put up on screen, and I'll put in the link of the description of the video here too. Let's assume that that's relatively accurate and that these are the top 10 channels based on subscriber numbers who would be geared towards new D&D players. Because financially, for Wizards of the Coast, that's your bread and butter. You want the people who haven't already bought all the material becoming interested in buying it, because that's how they're going to get the return on their money. These channels range from a little bit more than 100,000 subscribers up to Critical Role, which is the largest by far, which could be considered for new D&D players and conceivably viewed as a way to get people interested in Dungeons and Dragons or whatever game they would like to talk about, up to just about 2 million subscribers. So large range between them, but you do have channels where the smallest of these large channels are still more than 100,000 people. That's a large audience. Does your advertising money add up to millions and millions of dollars if we look at these top 10 channels? If these top 10 channels all came together and went to Wizards of the Coast and said, we're not working with Dungeons and Dragons anymore, or alternatively, they all went to PAIZO or to some other game company and said, we're all now going to be promoting you guys. Can you pay us to be able to do that? And what would you be willing to pay us, the top channels in Dungeons and Dragons, to tell our audience to instead play your game? Could PAIZO take that to the bank, that figure, whatever that would be, and say, this would let us grow as a company, and therefore the bank would get a return on their investment? Could they borrow whatever amount of money would be necessary for that? And what amount of money would that be? How much do we suppose Wizards of the Coast gave Critical Role to talk about the D&D Beyond purchase by Wizards of the Coast? That would be the size of the advertising market, because that's what Wizards of the Coast or any other similar sized company is willing to pay for that kind of advertising. That's the market that they're creating for that world. It isn't hundreds of millions of dollars. It's not millions of dollars. You could maybe argue it's in the hundreds of thousands, but it's probably a stretch. Not every one of those top 10 creators seems to have sponsors for all of their videos. I would imagine all of them have sponsors for at least some of their videos, and some of them, like Critical Role, definitely have sponsors for all of their videos. They're large enough. But not all of them have managed to capitalize on that type of market yet. They all have large enough channels that Wizards of the Coast would be familiar with their content and would be aware of them. But it doesn't look like Wizards of the Coast has seen the value in advertising on even all of these, the largest D&D channels, geared towards bringing new players into the game. So the most profitable segment for Wizards of the Coast. In summary, what does that show us about the advertising market? Well, it means Wizards of the Coast is either vastly undercalculating what this is worth, which is the argument from a lot of the community, and would also mean that companies like PAIZO are similarly undervaluing what that's all worth. So all the companies in the tabletop RPG world have come to the same conclusion, that it's not worth having content creators paid millions of dollars to talk about this stuff because it just can't generate that many sales for us. They may want to do it, but it only in a sense that it would have to generate that much money for them to actually see the value in doing it. Remember, a company can only be focused on increasing their bottom line from where it was before. They only care about generating money. They will do things that help content creators if it also helps them. And at the moment, when it comes to advertising, they don't seem to see a path towards that. They're running into a wall of, we can give you money, and we don't seem to get money back for it. Or their data analysis shows that they don't seem to be. As a professional business analyst, I would agree with that assessment. If Wizards of the Coast publicly said, listen, no harm to the content creators, we wish you all the best, but in terms of us giving you money to advertise our stuff and then expecting to get a return from that, the math doesn't work out. We don't see it. We could give you, thousands of dollars, but certainly not millions, not because we don't have it, but because if we gave you millions, we would just be giving you millions of dollars. It's not going to increase our revenue. That makes sense based on what I know about advertising and what I know about this basic marketing setup. That seems to be correct math. However, there's a chance that it could be wrong, and that would lead us to a path where your value as a community would be best expressed. I wouldn't worry about the advertising revenue that YouTube generates for Dungeons and Dragons. Whether that exists or not, it's not something you're going to impact. If you're trying to go up and fight with YouTube to get a cut of that, your best bet for that is to do it as an individual content creator. The YouTube Partnership Program is a very good advertising model for you as a content creator, not necessarily for the advertisers working with an individual content creator. But if you were to, as a community, work with some of those largest content creators, who I assume many are already on your side about Wizards of the Coast doing the wrong thing here with the OGL. I do notice most of the content creators, if not all of them, are still producing D&D content and don't seem to be stymied by these changes that Wizards of the Coast has implemented or by the risk of them doing it. They seem fine with the money that they're making. I don't blame them. If you run a business, you should keep doing the things that make you money. That's the best path forward for a business. But let's say as a community, you can convince some of those content creators. If you had even just one or two of those top 10 content creators decide to instead spend their time promoting Pathfinder instead of D&D, that would have a measurable impact to Dungeons and Dragons. That would be an interesting figure to find out how much. The issue is, I think the impact to Dungeons and Dragons would be more in the tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars. It definitely hurts them, but it's not in the millions of dollars that would be required to hurt them to a level to have them change their business plan, or if they're not going to learn their lesson, to shrink enough as a company and to have Paizo or any of the other competitors grow as a company through that increased revenue, through that advertising, to be able to unseat Dungeons and Dragons as the de facto game within the tabletop RPG world. There just doesn't seem to be a path for that. But if there is a path, where I would focus on trying to get that path is by aligning the community behind one or two of those prominent content creators, particularly the ones that are bringing people into Dungeons and Dragons, and focusing on their in-video advertising, the advertising that they themselves are doing as the content creator. If they stopped doing that advertisement, if they stopped collecting that money from Wizards of the Coast, from Dungeons and Dragons, would they be able to instead spin that energy towards Pathfinder? Maybe. And that would lead us to a future video where we'd also be talking about whether the audience for those channels is an audience there for Dungeons and Dragons specifically, or are they an audience for that content creator? And that will lead us further down that path as we unpack this discussion here too. I think for today, I'm going to leave that as the parting view, as another video towards the advertising revenue that's here. The measure of the revenue is what Wizards of the Coast is willing to spend on advertising. That's not in the millions of dollars. It might not be in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. It might be in the tens of thousands of dollars. What's the amount of money that Wizards of the Coast is specifically giving to content creators to talk about D&D? That amount of money is exactly what they think that market's worth. If you'd like to show how the market's worth more than that, show how content creators are not just getting passive income from YouTube, but influencing that market to spend more. Show how Paizo sees it differently than Wizards of the Coast and is willing to give money to those content creators. Give me examples of that happening, and then we can see that maybe Wizards of the Coast is missing something with advertising. But from what I can see, they have the market assessed correctly for advertisement, even though that definitely makes the community worth less from an advertisement perspective. It seems to me Wizards of the Coast has that assessed relatively well. Until then, we'll come up with another video here to go over some more of the content around advertising, because I think it's a fascinating topic. And again, if you like this type of content, let me know in the comments. Give me a like, hit that bell and subscribe, and looking forward to talking about this some more in the future here too. Until then, cheerio.